Thanks, everyone. When I started my own career in design just a little more than 20 years ago, it was very clear that design was perceived as something that played a big role in industry. We talked a lot about form follows function, the idea being that design actually makes products look better, makes logos really attractive to people so they want to buy the products belonging to that business. But actually, I think we've come a long way in the last 20 years, certainly through the work that I've been doing at the Design Council. I think design is evidently having a much bigger impact, not just on the economy, but actually on our society and also on our environment. So let's take a closer look at that. What do we mean by design having a big role in the economy? The Design Council's just published a piece of work looking at this just from a very fresh perspective. We've been looking at not only the difference design makes in the design sectors, so design agencies, for example, but also we're looking at businesses outside the design sector, looking at other wider sectors that are important to the UK and looking at what they use and how they use design. We're also looking at a much broader sphere of design. We're not just talking about product design, graphic design, architecture, engineering. We're talking about service design as well. We're talking about gaming design. Gaming is such an important part of our economy. And design skills are flourishing in very different areas. So we really need to understand what the full impact of that is. And this is the impact. It's quite an astonishing figure, but what does it actually mean? It roughly equates to 3/4 of the value of our financial services industry, which is really quite staggering. But even more important, we know that the role of design in the design economy has actually grown by just more than 50% over the last few years, which suggests that organisations are actually thinking about having more designers working in their organisations, and actually also with the rise of digital, which has probably a lot to do with these figures, the role of digital and design in a world where AI and automation are becoming ever more important is a major consideration. And I think when we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, and digital has a major role to play, we can't just imagine a world where the future is automation and robots or AI. We have to imagine, what does it mean for people? So again, design and the role of designers and a people-centered approach and empathy, that's really important, and it won't go away. So 68% of people in the design economy don't work for design agencies. They're working for businesses outside that sector, and that's quite staggering. So sectors like automation, aviation, aerospace, we're looking at life sciences and construction, financial services, as I mentioned before, they're all employing designers, and the number of employers looking for designers actually has started to really increase, and these figures are testament to that. If you're sitting in the audience thinking, well, what does that mean to me? I'm thinking about my future career. Well, think about this. The design economy, if it was an employer, would be the 9th biggest employer in the country, next to hospitality, which is equally a really important employer in the UK. So really, we should be thinking about this in a more considered way, that design isn't just something that we could work in the future industry of the design economy, but actually, what does it mean to be a designer? The world is looking at the UK as a leader in design, and what's really important is that these export figures of 7% UK export is really impressive, probably, for some of you, and I know we're speaking here tonight to a global audience. There are countries around the world that are gradually realising that design has a role to play. It's not just the UK. And in fact, we're now 6th in the world in terms of our design exports. Countries like China and South Korea are investing strategically significant amounts of design, from design education all the way through to supporting industry to use design. So I think that this is a really important point. We can't be complacent here. The fundamental point behind this is, in parallel, the number of people going in to study design in this country is declining. The pipeline of designers reduced by 61% over the last 6 years, which for us in the UK, we should be worried about. So what we need to do is think about how can we all think about applying or adopting design skills in our own work. If we're not a trained designer, how could we start to understand what design means to you, to me? These are the skills that the World Economic Forum considered to be skills that will be important in the fourth industrial revolution. These are skills that won't be readily automated. Creative problem solving, solving really complex problems at different levels of scale, looking at this from different standpoints. What do other people think about this problem? Critical thinking, looking at a problem from a number of perspectives is so important. And having the skills to do that, it's very, very difficult to do. We need to have people in the workforce who can do that. And finally, creativity. We all have great ideas, no matter what our subject matter expertise. But how do we know which ideas will land in the market or in the world successfully? Design is the process that will enable that to happen. So I didn't ask this question at the beginning, but hands up who here is a designer? Okay, so we have a number of hands out there. But if I read this quote to you, everyone designs who devises a course of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. If I ask now, hands up who here is a designer? Okay, so almost pretty much a full house. We're all involved. We would like to think that we're trying to do something for the better. Everything that we do is to try and make an improvement of some kind. I love this quote because it's from the 50s. But the real purpose behind this quote for me is that we're all designing. We're making design decisions every day, often not knowingly. So if we knew when those moments are to bring design in, like we do when we know to bring a financial person in, or someone who's an expert in IP, or someone who's a real expert in marketing, we should also be thinking equally, who's the designer in the room that can bring a design perspective to this problem? If I ask you, or tell you we need to build a bridge, how do you think we should approach this? There are so many different ways we could make this happen, and there are so many kinds of bridges in the world. We can look back in history, we can imagine future concepts. Back in history, we can imagine a bridge like this over a river in Scotland, or we can imagine a river or delta in China where there's a 36-mile-long bridge that was opened this very week. We could have a swing bridge, we could have a garden bridge, which is a concept that I'm sure will not go away for Londoners. There are so many different ways we could apply this. We don't even know yet what the problem is that we're trying to solve, do we? If I had asked you, how could you help me get a message to the other side of the river? We might have started from a completely different starting point. Someone might have said, well, why don't you pick up the phone? Why don't you email the message? Why don't you, even better still, get a boat and get it to the other side as quickly as you can? Slightly exaggerated point, but this is to try and say that out there, all the time, we see leaders and managers really relating to this. They're often presented with a task where they have to make something happen. And really, the scenario is that they have to deliver something that fundamentally they know is probably a great answer to the wrong question. And if we have the opportunity to take a step back and re-examine that question and ask, well, why? Think of Herb Simon, preferred situation, current situation, and preferred state. For who? Let's try and get under the skin of what the problem is from the people's perspective that we're trying to help. And as we're doing that, let's really understand multiple perspectives so we can get at the heart of someone's need. We call this methodology the double diamonds. There's literally two diamonds stuck together. Most of the world lives in the second diamond. We spend most of our time working in the first diamond. Here are two quick stories to bring that to life. One was working with a startup team 10 years ago, brilliant team of graduates from a university just down the road from here. And they had really special technology and they knew it. They had £1 million of funding behind them to get their startup on the road. And essentially, this technology is invisible to the naked eye, so you can't even see it. So design in terms of a form follows function is redundant here. They came into the design council saying, how could you help us think about building the startup? They were already thinking about how can we use design to design the business as well as the product. They were very clear about the first application that they wanted for their product. It's a very specific need. This is like a sensitive nose. Imagine a nose that can smell and detect hazardous chemicals and agents in our atmosphere and tell us immediately about it. So this nose could sniff out all sorts of health warnings in all sorts of places around the world. So why are we limiting this to one particular market? So when we started working with them, and this is their product, and in fact the product's inside that chip, we started to ask these questions. They started to think about all of the different ways of applying it, from food going off in the fridge in someone's home, all the way up to managing the health in a food processing factory, and everything in between those scales. So if we think about, that's just one example. the food we eat, the water we drink, and the air we breathe. And from that first diamond mindset, they were able to go through a process where they unraveled ideas probably in about 7 different industries. Over the course of the last decade, they have systematically applied their technology across all of those industries. But I know that at the time, they were doing it very much from a design-led approach. They were completely focused on not just what works in the lab, but what works in the real world. Let's be people-driven about this, and let's understand and test our ideas in the real context that this technology is going to be used, because we're just the people that are coming up with the science bit. The actual product will be taken to market by many other people in the supply chain. We're not necessarily the ones that are going to be delivering it to the end user, but we still need to understand what's going to work for people. One of the original ideas that we explored at the time was looking at how this sensitive nose not only can detect the health of the air around us, but also our own internal air. And quite impressively, last year, they started to get on the road taking this product to market, which is a breathalyzer, which most of you might have heard about breathalyzers in the context of police using it on a driver that might be over the alcohol limit. This is a breathalyzer to detect your health, so very early stages, perhaps various forms of cancer or chronic diseases, diabetes, and so on. This is actually really pioneering territory, and there are startups and organizations around the world that are looking at different ways that we can prevent people from developing cancer. So they're using this technology as a health prevention measure now, which is really impressive. And again, the founders would say that this isn't just the design of the product here, this is thinking about all the ways that product will be used and will help people to improve their quality of life and their health. That's not an only story of a business, that there are 5,000 businesses more every day that we work with who've used design in that first diamond way. And actually, although the results behind me, we found those a few years ago, every pound those businesses have spent on design, they've delivered these results. We followed it up this year just to find out, almost like a tracker, how do these businesses continue to survive and thrive? And we took a national control group and we found that 91% of businesses like the one I've just given you are actually surviving and still trading, but thriving and being productive. 91% compared to 49% of businesses overall in the UK that haven't used design. So I think that really points to the fact of the economic case for design. But what about the social case? How does design work in our lives for our health and well-being? A few years ago, we worked with a government department to look at an issue that was happening in accident and emergency environments up and down the country. These areas of our life are under huge challenge. We read about them in the papers every day. It isn't just the pressures of budget, it's actually the pressures of the environment and the effects of that on the people who are coming into contact with that environment. Violence and aggression is a cost to the NHS, and so the challenge here, the design challenge, was how can we reduce the number of incidents of that happening in A&E environments? But rather than starting from a budgetary question, we decided to look at this, obviously, being design from a human perspective. And one of the things, having got going on New Year's Eve, which couldn't be more pressurised or a busier time of year, in 3 hospitals in very different parts of the country, we spent hours talking to and observing and listening to people who come into contact with A&E from the patient's perspective and the people they're with, through the staff that work there, porters, frontline surgeons, nurses, everybody in the front line. But also people that are passing through, people who are probably dropping people off in A&E, ambulance drivers, people who are sort of transitory through the environment. What we found was that the waiting experience was one of the triggers, or one of the areas of trigger for aggressive behaviour or threatening behaviour, certainly, because the waiting experience was often a very difficult one. The perception before you get there, for any of you who've had the misfortune to be in A&E, is that you will arrive, you'll probably get treated, and then you will get, hopefully, you'll get out of there as quickly as possible. When we were talking to the professionals in an A&E environment, their perspective was, well, it's actually a little bit more detailed than that. You will arrive, you will have to book in, we'll have to do a triage of some kind, we'll then monitor you, you'll have to be treated, hopefully everything will work out well, and you will get to go home as quickly as possible. From the patient's point of view, this was the experience. We're waiting, and we wait, and we wait, and we wait. So everything to them, all the bits that happen in between are almost invisible and irrelevant because it feels just like you're sitting there waiting the whole time. What we realised was actually we could redesign the A&E waiting experience for people so that we're managing their expectations. The thing that was often the trigger for people getting anxious was they weren't sure what was happening next. There was no information being displayed to tell them that. And it's often very difficult for staff in the front line to make sure they're conveying that information to people. So design used here, you might think it's quite obvious, but we heard earlier the importance of visual language. We live in a world where words and numbers are critical, but so too is communicating visually. So this very visual way of communicating, this is where you are now, this is where you might end up, this is ultimately the steps that you'll go through to get to this point. Really, to have those displayed right across the environment, and not just in the first waiting room, but all the way through the A&E environment, so that you could tell it's almost navigating you through the patient experience, but in a very visual way, helped to actually keep people calm. It helped to convey and reassure them that they knew where they were in the system and they were being cared for in the right way in the system. There were also things we looked at about waiting times, conveying information about how long they're likely to be waiting during, in between those moments of treatment. Over 6 months in those 3 hospitals, the figure on this slide that's really important for our point of view is that the number of incidents reduced by 50%, which is really staggering in such a short space of time. We found out last year that 13 hospitals across the country have since taken this system up, this system of communicating more effectively to people. They need to get their hands on that because it's having a real impact. We also found that the NHS have adopted this in their procurement framework, which should enable many more hospitals around the country to take this system up. The thing that these 2 stories have in common, they're very different stories, very different worlds, but actually, first of all, rather than looking at the problem just through a technical lens or a waiting room lens, we looked at it from a people-centered lens. You know, really looking at this from the world of empathy, which again is a skill that cannot be automated by the robots in a 4th industrial revolution. We really need to put ourselves in the shoes of the people that we're trying to understand in order to solve a problem for them. Secondly, as I hope you've seen, you know, we're communicating here much more effectively if we're communicating visually, and we need to be brave about that. As much as words and numbers matter, visual language is absolutely critical, and even more in a complex world of words and numbers and 4th industrial revolution. Both examples were collaborating with organisations, with customers, with staff. We were looking at the problem from so many different perspectives. To not collaborate now in this world where innovation is so important is really critical. You absolutely have to work with other people to understand their problems and bring people together that you might not all work with in your day-to-day to understand what problems they're experiencing. We're more likely to get a very different outcome if we're doing that. And finally, living with something for a little while before you make it a reality. I think we're used to that in the world of software, but less so in hardware. The idea that you're testing and you're prototyping and leaving something in existence before it becomes a reality is critical. So how might you use design? Businesses that you might work for, 59% of them said of a survey we did earlier this year, of 1,000 businesses, 59% of them said that they're going to really need design skills in the next 5 years because they know it's going to be the engine for innovation in their organisations. So I know that businesses out there understand that, but we need to do more in the areas of health, in housing, and where we live. Design needs to be used to create better places and health systems for people. And there are thought leaders all over the world commenting on this right now. So there are resources out there that you can refer to looking at this, from cultural change to design in organisations all the way through to governments and how design can be used to deliver better policy, through to how we can solve some of our most complex challenges in our world, taking a design-led approach. So I hope some of you tonight will be thinking about that in your next future careers, in the studies that you're undertaking, and that you will leave this presentation today thinking about what design means to you and how it will impact on your own career. Thank you very much.